Tonight, let's just sit and enjoy some history with a lifelong, I believe, Yamhill County resident, right? So that's like 25 years. And one of our local historians. I love listening to him. Welcome, Kory Knutz.
Presuming I don't have to use this mic, y'all can hear me, and probably not hooked to anything either, so probably wouldn't matter. So I got my first interest in history riding in my grandparents' Buick on Sunday afternoons. After going to church, we drive all over Yamhill County, and my grandparents came here in the 30s, and actually both sides of my family came here in the 30s, and so they experienced, you know, stuff we're not going to talk about tonight, but it was the Depression time, and they left Kansas to come out here where there's some kind of work. And so that sparked an interest. And there's how many times I must have asked Grandpa and Grandma, what was it like in the old days? You know, well, to me, the old days was before I was born. And there was a lot of stories, a lot of good things that piqued my interest. And so naturally, later on, after seeing some historic photos, they were always intriguing to me. It's intriguing. So I guess here I am. So you're stuck with me. You'll probably get your value since this is free. So kind of what I want to talk about tonight is what I usually like to do is try to set up the scenario of what it was like in 1850 or 1840 and why people are going to go over 2,000 miles of no roads or barely trails, you know, through snake bites, disease, dirty water that make people sick and die. Out of the 350,000 people that traveled over the trail, and that's an estimate, as many as 30,000 died. And so that's kind of like a war, you know, when you have that kind of casualties. And it equals out to be about every mile, there's 10 to 15 people that died per mile. Now, not evenly, you know, you probably had a hill where there's 2,000 people where, you know, wagons would tip over, kids would fall off, and they'd get rolled under these big wheels on this wagon you're seeing back here, which is a replica. I don't know a lot about that wagon, but I think there's pieces in it that are original. Cynthia was telling me. Where you at? Yep, back and forth. So imagine this is your 1840s Buick or SUV, you know, four-wheel something that's not all drive. So you get out here, and the reason why people are so ambitious to leave is all the real estate on the East Coast is getting locked up. It's kind of like living in McMinnville today. You want to buy a house? How much is it? Okay, well, maybe I'll, you know, move somewhere else, right? So the opportunity was rich over here, but so was the risk. And so we're going to talk tonight a little bit also about three of the main guys that were in town. So you had Newby, which everybody knows about. Well, I assume everybody knows about. We got Newby School. You've got Baker. That's John Baker. He's on the north side. So he was the first one that came here. And then the other guy is Samuel Cozine. And we are really narrowing the window of who we're going to talk about because there was 30 families that came in one of the first wagon trains. So we can talk about 30 different families, but we don't have that much information. And we also don't have all the pictures. Like maybe Michael here could help me, but I can't find a picture of John Baker. So there might be one, but you're just not going to get that tonight. So moving along here. Now that's a map. I'm sure you all can read all that fine print. But the main point is, man, my Lowe's battery, this isn't working very good. So that's a 2,000 mile journey from clear over here, east side of Kansas. And along the way, a lot of people were, they're coming out here because they could claim land. You didn't have to buy it. If you were a single man, you could claim 320 miles or 320 acres. And if you're a married man, you can do twice that much at 640. So that's great. So a lot of people got married along the way, like true love. And so you're gonna do, oh, what? You're 14? It was different back then. So coming along here, we got Newby. I'll learn how to run this. Oh, there's some of the wagon train And, you know, there's not a lot of pictures of the wagon trains and all that stuff because who was out there? You know, there was no press. Nobody had cameras. In fact, people were foolish enough to haul pipe organs and pianos and, you know, wagons would tip over in the river. You know, Jacob Hahn, who was a millwright, he built grist mills in the area. I think about 12 or 13 of them. His wagon tipped over by Unity, Oregon, if you know where that's at on the way out towards Ontario, almost Idaho, in the Powder or the Burnt River. Lost all of his tools, recovered very few because, you know, iron sinks and maybe it's rapids, you're not going to find it. But he did, I believe he helped build the one here in town in McMinnville for Newby. And Newby was responsible for building the first grist mill in town. Not the first one, I mean, the only one. There was nothing going on. Like it was, every farmer has a square mile. So, you know, you really didn't see your neighbor. You didn't talk over a fence as often as you think you would. And so there we got, there's William Newby. He was born in 1820. And one interesting thing about his trip out here, which I just learned, at one certain point, and I think this is somewhere near Boardman or Pendleton, details escape me, but they procured a few canoes. And I don't know if some said that they built their own canoes, but they were going to get off the wagon because, gosh, if you could just float and have the current carry you down, that's almost enjoyable, you know? And so they transferred to canoes. William and his wife were on the canoe. They're floating down the river. And at some point, somewhere near Umatilla area, boom, they hit a rock. This is a rock that's under the water, but it's just high enough to knock them off the canoe. And unlike what we see today, we have dams, water control. We have big lakes and reservoirs backed up that make for great boating up in the Columbia Gorge. But back then, there were some areas that were so, dangerous, you wouldn't take a boat down. You'd need to get off on the side of the riverbank and somehow try to weave your way through all those giant rocks that you see still there today. Well, they get bumped off their canoe and they're literally standing on something way smaller than your table, probably 3 feet around, they said. And so they're standing out there for hours waiting for somebody to come by and pick them off of this rock. It looks like they're standing like they're walking on water, because they're on a recessed rock. But they made it. And had they not made it, well, we wouldn't be talking about McMinnville tonight. So that's quite a pivotal moment. Everything that happens in life has, repercussions to it. This is Samuel Cozine. Samuel and his wife claimed the land south of, now I'm just going to guess. But it was a Linfield College area, and it didn't reach much into the 3rd Street district because that was all Newby's land. So Newby had the center area, and Cozine is to the south. He was also a blacksmith, and his shop was somewhere right along where the Linfield College is today. And so after the town got going, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but after the town got going, there's his wife. And here's the first, well, that's not the first home. This is John Baker's home. We're kind of bouncing around here a little bit. So John Baker's on the north side. So his south fence line was right where Muchas Gracias and Sherry's is. Went all the way to Workman Stadium, and it went a mile north, so it encompassed all of, well, obviously Baker Field. That's where the kids play soccer. And that was donated to the school district back then. So yeah, we'll get there. We'll talk about this a little bit. So John built his cabin in the spring of 1844. So what happens is you come out the Oregon Trail and you're at the mercy of generous people, and you're praying, I hope there's generous people. And almost always, they found those generous people at Fort Vancouver or Oregon City. Portland didn't exist yet. In fact, Portland was only worth $200 in 1840. $200 buys the Port Portland. So anyway, he gets out here, and the first thing you have to do is build a cabin after you winter over eating other people's food, because by the time you get over that 2,000-mile journey, it's October, sometimes it's November. People are starting to get sick. They're wearing their shoes out. They get into the Fort Vancouver or anyone that would be gracious enough to look after them. And then the next year, you got to get out, claim your land, and then start building a cabin so you have shelter. Cut your firewood, try to clear some land. So you're clearing your land and cutting firewood and making cabin wood all in one kind of stroke, but no power saws, just all old school. And so brings us to the next point, and that is, your next thing you'd have to build is a barn. And part of the farming process, this is one that's just absolutely stunning to me. The farmers back then, it would take 250 to 300 man hours to handle 5 acres of wheat. First thing they planted out here was wheat. You could buy the seeds up at Fort Vancouver, and you go out, you do your plowing, which is next picture. Doesn't that look painful? Single plow, and we've watched this out here, in the spring when we do the plow, and so after they get the land cleared, somehow get stumps pulled out of the ground, then comes harvest time, and so you would have, like I said, 300 man hours just to try to harvest what we get off of an acre and a half today. And a farmer today will harvest that amount in a half hour. One man, one machine, compared to 300 man hours. So, and the bushels per acre is phenomenal compared to back then. Here's just a little typical farm, very simple construction. Typically, you can really identify the old farmhouses around the area just by how narrow the gables are, because most farmers didn't want to have a 30-foot wide gable. How are you going to get those, all that lumber up on the second story? They usually built things that were 12 or 14 feet wide, very simple, and that's your classic farmhouse construction. Back then, they didn't even bother with valleys. They just do one roof, keep it simple, get your shelter. And now we're coming up to where the birth of McMinnville is starting to be seen. And that is that Newby says, hey, we've got these farms, we got people harvesting wheat, and mind you, there's no bank, there's no McMinnville. McMinnville 3rd Street's just probably a wheat field or a cow pasture, right? And so first in 1853, he gets either Jacob Hahn or maybe Hess, one of them, to build the grist mill. And the grist mill, grist is a fancy word for grind. It's where you take your wheat heads and you smash them into flour. Once you've got flour, you've got a commodity that can be shipped all over the world, and it's almost worth cash. In fact, because they didn't have a bank back then, what you would do if you're the farmer and you're bringing in your gunny sacks of cleaned wheat, which that's a whole process that I don't even really have time to talk about tonight. But anyway, you would, for every pound, so let's say you give them 100 pounds of wheat, you'd get 50 pounds of flour in return. They would keep the other product and sell it. Boom. You don't have to ride a horse all day long up to Oregon City to cash your check. It's almost an insult back then. If somebody wrote you a check, they'd be like, are you kidding me? Like, that I have to go clear up to Oregon City to cash that thing, and then I got to stay in a hotel, and then I got to come back, and then I'll be broke. I'll be more broke than I am right now. And so that's exactly what the people now. I don't want this to be a bashing session on Lafayette, but Lafayette, unfortunately, lacked the vision that Newby and all the forefathers of McMinnville had, and that's one thing we're going to unpack here pretty soon. So that's what was going on. People would go in and they'd buy their goods at Lafayette. Lafayette's the oldest town out west compared to, Astoria is older, but Lafayette is, 1847, they platted it, and they had like 30 different stores by 1850. It blew up really big and fast, especially after the gold rush. And you think, why the gold rush? Like, why would Lafayette sprout up and be something notable? Well, it was a supply town, and anybody that was educated, or it's like they called up AAA and said, hey, which way should I go to California? They'd say, well, you need to go on the west side of the Willamette. If you go on the east side, you're going to encounter all the valleys and gorges over there in Oregon City. They don't want to do rock climbing. They just want to roll on nice flat ground. And so Lafayette was a natural crossing place. So when you're in Lafayette at Bill's Market's on your right while you're going east towards Portland. That's Bridge Street. And you look both ways, and there's no bridge, right? But there was a bridge, and it went over the Yam Hill. And it's because the river was fairly shallow right there. It made a great place to take your wagons across on the Yam Hill right there. And they could get all their supplies they needed, and they may not have a supply town for a long time. And they're headed to California, Northern California. Well, Samuel Cozine did great. So Samuel Cozine's house is the one right next to the swimming pool across the street, kind of by First Federal, right across the street. He found $6,000 He went in 1849, got the gold fever and came back a success. He had a nest egg that set them for the rest of their lives. And they built that very nice Victorian home that we see that was restored, I think back in the 90s or the 80s, something like that. And so we don't have any pictures of the original mill, but those are the original stones. Those were made over in Oregon City and dragged on a skid with oxen all the way back to McMinnville. And they built the mill, and that's not the mill they built. That's the second mill they built. And I'm probably just going to suffer with this thing the whole time. It still feels like a point at it. So the back half is all wood. It says Star Mills, and the front half is all brick. Right. And so there was also a water wheel. Now I should tell you the location. So the first mill was located right near the play structure in the park is today, close to that very spot. And the picture I showed you, you can walk down there and read everything I'm telling you right now. On the little plaque, it's very informative. But that one was purposely burnt down in, I think, 1889 or something. And then this one was the replacement. Probably better technology. It was, a few decades later. And there was a 21-foot water wheel down in the city park. And that powered, turned a gear, made all the things happen inside that building that needed to happen, which was grinding wheat. And Newby commissioned and had a ditch dug that went all the way out at a funny angle. And that funny angle today is Wallace Road. The one with the oak tree in the middle, you have to go around the oak tree. Like, why is this road at a 30-degree angle? Well, because that was the topographically smart trajectory to go up to Hidden Hills area and catch Baker Creek and divert it, have it come down that ditch and roll over that wheel. Now we're looking at the back half of that Star Mill after the fire in 1912. And that's just the skeleton that was left. Some of you in this room would probably even remember, some of us, swimming in the pool that was right next to this big, tall brick relic that stood a little while longer. There's the mill pond. Now, that's the mill pond that backed up behind, so that ditch water we're talking about filled up a large portion of the lower city park. That's nice with picnic tables and little pavilions. Well, you would have been swimming back then. And the mill that we've been looking at was over here. And for all of you out there, that's just a little rectangle box. Sorry. And this little white thing, that's the pavilion, which is something we're going to talk about in about 14 more slides. And there's a picture of the water wheel, kind of hard to make out, but you can see this right here. I think there's a buoy in there somewhere or two. Star Mill Way is just right up here. And then it turns away from us. Wow. There's the Cozine house. And Samuel Cozine was a very, gregarious guy, happy. They called him Uncle Sam. And that wasn't like a slam against like the government or something. They liked him, And now back to the Baker thing. So this is a plank sidewalk that goes out to Baker Field. And so either this was on maybe Evans Street-ish. I don't know if we know. Do we know? We don't know. I'm asking smart people in the room. In case I don't know. So, and so when you get out there to Sherry's, and we were talking about that earlier, that was all Baker's land. And Baker really wanted to help out by giving some land to the school. So it included all the area where the district office was, Baker Field, and all the way over to the stadium. And so in order for kids to get out there in the middle of winter and go play in the field, they at least had to have like a bridge over the mud to get out there. Like the streets in downtown weren't even paved until 1912. We're still talking, this is old stuff. So there's that kind of a modern day picture we have today. There's Sherry's. Pretty much you know what I'm talking about. Now we're going to move towards the bank. This is another issue, or not issue. It was a winning decision that the forefathers of McMinnville made to get an edge over Lafayette. We weren't the courthouse. We didn't have the courthouse. It was over Lafayette. And so it's 1883. The workmen's come out and they say, hey, we want to build a bank. Well, they told that to the people in Lafayette. They're like, talk to the hand. So we're not interested. And you'd think, why? Why would you not want to have a bank? Why does the people in the community wanted a bank, but the business owners did not? And that was because they could mark up like 20% for a check fee. It's kind of like this payday loan places, you know, they're like, ooh, we can get you. Well, it's the same story I already told you. Gotta go up to Oregon City, blah, 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 you know. And so the workmen's leave Lafayette quite disheartened, you know, solemnly moseying off north back towards, I think, Cove Orchard, Yamhill. And story had it that some of our forefathers, whoever they were, caught up with them and said, hey, come to McMinnville and build a bank. Because at this point, what I hadn't mentioned was Newby had kind of started like 5 acres of the downtown area and said, free lots, come build your store. We're going to make a town here. And that happened because naturally people, all the farmers would roll in and they'd stop at the corner post before they go into the grist mill to unload their bags. Well, you get a lineup of people because harvest time, everybody's doing everything at the same time. It's just like trying to drive to Portland, you know, it stacks up, right? And so people naturally just mingle, talk. And there's an old Dutchman that had a store that he eventually built right where First Federal is. He could sell you all the essentials, dry goods, spices, scissors, thread, whatever you need to make it through. And so William Newby, he was like, hey, build a store. It's like, okay, you know. And so multiple people started doing that. And even Samuel Cosine moved his blacksmith shop from down by Linfield College and moved it over to behind the Cosine house. It's not there today. So now we see a picture of the first bank, and it's very notable. If you're ever looking at old photos of McMinnville, anytime you see these round windows, that is the only place there's round windows that I know of in downtown McMinnville. And so they very happily set up shop, opened up the bank, and now Lafayette doesn't have a bank. Now people in Lafayette come to McMinnville. And then also this is connected. This I could go on for all kinds of stories about this car. It's actually back here in the other room over here. It's the first car to come to McMinnville, about $500. 1901. It was powered by steam, but the steam was maintained by a gasoline ignited pilot, which scared everybody to death because gasoline back then was kind of like saying, could you throw this dynamite around? You know, that's how they thought about it. You know, gasoline was so flammable, it scared. There was some accidents with gasoline, as you can imagine. We still have them. And so in order to get to the beach, because this was the first car to ever make it to the beach, they had to hide their gas in kerosene cans and have the stagecoach do their dirty work for them and haul it out to certain points along the way. It took them 2 weeks to get there. They broke their wheel, and then it took even longer to get it home. And there's more details we could do, but I have to talk really fast. So here's the, I don't know if that's the second railroad depot or the first. It made it till about 1956 when they tore it down. It was rumored to be a brothel, a house of prostitution. In fact, that's where we get, we've all heard the phrase, oh boy, I think we're in the red light district. You know, well, where do we figure that out? Well, the signalmen on the trains had a red signal light. And when they went to the room to visit the late evening business, their lantern sat outside of the door. There was the red light. There's the red light district. Here's our beautiful courthouse. I so regret that we tore it down, but we did. It was 121 feet tall, 14,000 square feet, 3 floors tall. Beautiful, ornate, all kinds of nice woodwork. I do recall my dad telling me a story. He had some kind of a hernia operation. He was in the general hospital across the way in 1964 or 5 or whatever, whenever they knocked down the courthouse. And he remembers looking out the window, and they had set like a little D2 crawler cat on the 3rd floor. It was driving around knocking down walls. So that's what I know about that. The next thing that we got in our arsenal was a good water source, but not immediately. So 1889 is the beginning of Mac Water life. And that's just 1 year after we got the courthouse from Lafayette. That's a whole other story that takes a little too long. And so now we had our own water. And so the story goes, at one point, this is probably around 1900-ish, you know, the oldest building on 3rd Street is the La Rambla building, where the restaurant is. But you'll go over there and you look up there and it says 1905. Well, you're wrong. That's not the oldest building, but that's when they refurbished the building. My theory is, I'll just say theory, but I think that's where the fire was because it was a tavern. And there's a story of the firemen on their Wednesday night drills. Back then, they didn't have a fire truck with an engine and all that. They had a hose cart, but they had fire hydrants. But back then, they called them constant pressure hydrants. Well, that's just a given now, you know. Why would you have a hydrant that doesn't have pressure to it? But that was amazing because nobody's over there pumping, you know. So, and the way it was constant pressure was they had these floating pumps that pulled the water off the top of the M Hill River down behind a brick plant behind Lincoln College down on the river. So obviously they're drawing pretty hard on this pump system to fight this fire. So what happened was the firemen realized that their tavern was on fire while they're in the tavern. You know, they run around the corner, they're getting their gear on, and they didn't have to go very far. I don't know what the next picture is. Well, that's not helpful. So they go around the corner, they get all their gear, come around, they're fighting the fire. They turn this constant pressure hydrant on and dribbles come out. They're like bang, 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 you know, like what, you know, they're checking all the sources. Well, what they figured out after a lot of stress and pressure, there's a crawdad jammed in the nozzle. Got sucked off the river, jammed in the nozzle. So, you know, that was a problem. Now, previous to this, all the women in town, probably even some smart men too, right? They hated the water supply because we're drinking Yamhill water, you know. You can look at it, it didn't look any different back then. It's a low gradient stream, it's murky. It always does this. It doesn't move fast enough to be crystal clean. In fact, some of the brochures in the early days said, come to McMinnville, the sparkling, beautiful waters of the Yamhill River. And enjoy the constant pressure hydrants and water. So consequently, the women of town bragged about they killed two birds with one stone. Because after this incident, they decided we are going to go up to the Coast Range, which is now Haskins Reservoir, and get a actual clean water that we don't have to clean up so much, right? And so they said, well, the town tavern burnt down and we got better water. So win-win. There's my grandpa Argyle. He helped work on a project. This thing was removed, I think 2005 or something, but it was like a tower. My brother's here and he's nodding. He works for Water and Light. He's a water dude. But I think it was to pull water off at different levels of the lake. And so this is 1956. It was built previous to that. So my guess is there used to be a park below the dam where people go for a Sunday picnic. And I think he had his picture taken because it was sentimental, right? So out by west of McMinnville, you've got Powerhouse Hill Road. Everybody heard of that? Well, that's because there's a powerhouse there. There's still a dam there that's about 10 feet tall. The water goes over. That was one area where they made some electricity. And I just threw this one in just because it's such a good picture. Wow. And it's a sinking boat. But, you know, Yamhill isn't very deep, so you can't sink too far. So one of the big problems on the Yamhill River was trying to navigate these big old boats. Some of them 100 feet long, most of them were 70-ish that would come to Dayton. And anytime a log would fall in, a tree falls over and it's just underwater and you can't see it, you'd get hung up on a snag. And then that happens, you know, pulls you under or something. That was a few miles west of Dayton on the way to the Willamette where that happened, Mike's Pole or something like that. Hey, this is this really cool pavilion that we built. It was bragged to be, somebody bragged about it, to be the largest auditorium outside of Portland. I think the year was like 1911 or 13 or I haven't been using my notes, so we better figure this out. Not that there will be a quiz or anything. 1908 to 1922. Didn't last very long, but it had these 4 towers on every corner, very symmetrical. But it was torn down because apparently it was not structurally sound. So they must have got a little bit on that one, I guess. I don't know. And then there was a bear in the park. Come on, kids, let's go down to the city park. There's a bear down there, you know, and a whole bunch of wildlife from the area. That didn't last too long. But eventually the whole mill site was deeded over to the city and the city bought it for maybe $1. I don't know, I'm making that part up, but they got it real cheap and they made it into a park. So one of the first things they did was put a bear in there. Carnegie, if you're very astute, library, over 31 libraries were built in Oregon with funding from Carnegie back east. He funded libraries all over all over the world, yes, at least in the United States. So for a $10,000 matching grant, we matched that 10,000 and now we have a library. And I like this picture because it kind of captures, it's a little hard to see, but before about 1884, there just wasn't any brick buildings on 3rd Street. It was all what we had available. We have a lot of trees, got a lot of lumber, it's cheap. Problem with all wood construction, we all know, fire hazard, stuff like that. So just about nearly every town, at least in this area, that had a lot of brick buildings, had a brick plant nearby. You didn't want to have to haul bricks very far for obvious reasons. And so here's an actual picture of that same angle. Notice this arch in the middle. I forgot everything there was to know about that arch. It was pretty cool. It was made out of wood and it didn't last a whole long. I think it was
temporary.
built for, it was temporary. It was built for a celebration for military or something related.
The Grand Army of the Republic,
Yes.
Union Veterans Association.
So the next several pictures are progression. There it is today. So we'll go back. Boom, boom. Now it's a realtor office.
Yep.
Well, before that, it was a gas station, Shell station. There we go. There's the Shell station. Montgomery Ward, Smithsonian Center, 1933. And my grandpa worked in that service station. And we've all seen this picture a few times back when service was service. They even check your oil. Now, anyway. Watkins Parts Supply. There's the beginning of Davis Auto Parts, 1918 to what we have today. That was located across the street from what we were just looking at. And now if you're to look at this, it would be the first federal building that they just put up. Watkins was on the mother's side, eventually became Davison. Look at those muddy streets.
Whoa.
Oh, so this is before 1912. And look at all the wood. Tom, you told me where this picture was taken, didn't it? Where are you, Tom? Which corner was this?
That's standing at the city hall, looking diagonally across the street towards the first federal.
Yeah, that's why it's in this order. So if you go to the next picture, sorry. That was later. They put a nice brick building in, the Wells Lamont Glove Factory. I'm just shamelessly plugging my grandparents. That was the first place they worked when they got here from Kansas. My grandma sewed thumbs on gloves and stuff like that. They were happy to have any kind of work with the Great Depression. There's the view today. And this is the second baked building in town, and eventually it was the beginnings of Oregon Mutual. The Water and Light has had its office in there. And actually this, oh, well, that's 2011. This is old. They did a lot of nice work on it recently, and it looks even better than this. The next several pictures are a progression. There it is originally. And, you know, they didn't tile, all that tile, ceramic tile or whatever's down on the lower half was probably a 1950s remodel, butchered it. I like this because this has the old police station, the jail, the fire hall used to be located on the backside, and the fire trucks pulled out onto 2nd Street. Remember, even when I was a kid, it's in my time span. There's another picture of the police or the fire department, and that's probably where they had the siren on that big tower to blast our ears with emergency sounds. This is another great picture. This is actually a cropped picture. There's one of these down on 3rd Street. It's a 6-foot long picture, and they call it a bird's eye view. It's 1927. And so what we see here is the railroad depot that we see today, 1913. And this guy that lived in this house, he's George. He owns this hotel. And this is the first time I noticed this. So the first half of the Douglas Hotel, which is where Thai Country is built. And this burnt down, I think, about 1922. 100 years ago, and then they finished out an identical building out to there where the Lex Tavern was. This is the bistro, the restaurant. And look at that courthouse. Is that phenomenal? Yeah. A lot of times people look at it and go, oh, there's Linfield. But you're actually, that's over here. And Linfield kind of made it into the picture if we saw the whole picture. But you're not going to see the whole picture. There is the hotel that we were just looking at. And I always like to point out, I mean, everybody's gathered there. It wasn't because it was a busy hotel day. It was because it might be your one in a chance in a lifetime to have your image captured in a photo. And well, it's pretty pixelated out, not very clear, but people would stand on roofs from balconies anywhere to get into that picture. And one reason that McMinnville never had any major fires. Oh, good. It's only 6:37. I'll slow up a little. So this is the Wright building, and it had a steam plant in the back that blew hot air all over town, right? Underground. And the merchants in town loved it. They didn't have to build fires and stoke their stoves. They didn't have to worry about embers popping out and burning their wood floors and setting the world on fire. It covered about 11 blocks. And here again, we see that one arch we were mentioning earlier, just the edge of it. And in June of about the same year, they took out that other fire or railroad depot, was when they took the steam plant out. The boiler stack on the back was starting to lean away from the building. So like, ooh, that's not safe. And so there was some heartache with not having steam heat because everybody had their radiators all over. That was a bummer, but one thing's for sure, we are always in a state of transition, and even today, This is where Two Dogs was, or Taylordale Hardware, where I bought one of my first lawnmowers. Check out how they're digging. No excavators, no hydraulics, horse, wagon, shovels. There's the News Register building across the street, which used to be Odell's Tires and several other things. And there's a modern day picture to tie it together for you. See? Before and afters are always fun. IOOF building. Probably a lot of you know. I mean, there was all kinds of social clubs before we had social media. And this one was, oh man, was it International Organization of Oddfellows? Yeah. Order. What a name, right?
International order.
Order. What did I say? Organization. No. Order. Yeah, like there's an order of Oddfellows. Like I'm up here in the Oddfellows. I'm more odd than you are. But they, a lot of them, sometimes they'd have a bowling alley in them. It was a great men's social club. You had the Elks, you had the Masons. There's today, and there's back then. So obviously they painted it at some point. I heard some reading somewhere one time where they used to think that the buildings that were coated were fancier than the brick buildings. I think the brick buildings look better myself, but so a lot of people tended to paint their bricks, to try to up their game or something. I don't know. So here's McMinnville's Hotel Elberton. Originally started out as 2 floors, and then it grew. Nope, grew this way. 2 more floors. But I don't know what happened, but funding was cut. It was just raw studs upstairs for decades after that. And then not until the Hotel Oregon people, McMinnville's came in, they finished out and made for a pretty easy remodel because you don't have to wonder what's in the walls because you can see through them. And then there's all the stories of haunted and this and that. But there's a lot of kids goofing around up there with flashlights any day of the week, probably trying to make people think things are haunted. So it could just use your imagination. There's the hotel lobby. A few things have changed in this picture. I think they moved this wall over. Now you just walk straight back to the bathroom. And there it is today, with a bunch of pretty maple trees that were planted in the 70s. And this hotel is where Serendipity Ice Cream is. It's next to the old movie theater. This one was the fanciest hotel on 3rd Street as far as I heard. And we'll just keep going here. And there was all kinds of churches all over in McMinnville. A lot of them typically look like this with a beautiful belfry tower. This is the first Christian church. And I keep going the wrong way. There it is today. It's not there, right? The backside of OMI, Oregon Mutual. And all wood construction. In the Columbus Day storm in 1962, top this whole section blew up, landed in the street. And my personal tie to that story is my mom and dad were scheduled to get married on that very day, October 12th, 1962. And the minister, Osborne, he had a conflict with the schedule. He said, look, can we bump you one way or the other? And so it ended up being September 21st. And what a easier way to start the marriage, right? They made it 56 years. Why am I going the wrong way? This building, Farnham Electric used to be in this building, as far as I understand. There was rumors at one point that it was also a brothel. I think rumors are just started just so you have something to talk about, right? And now for some of the people of Yandell County, just again, see this narrow gable, easier to build. It's a farmhouse. Do we know who these people are? I don't. Maybe somebody does, but just trying to capture, you know, a simpler time. We'll snow scene. Look at those icicles. Now, back in the day, that would have been a very elaborate home. Dormers, all that woodwork, all that fancy construction work, it could happen. You just had to have money. In order to have money, you had to probably own like a shipping company or the newspaper, like the Pittock Mansion. And here again, here's everybody. I'm like standing in your way. I now realize that we're almost done. Everybody would gather to get into the picture. No, another thing people do is they look at these old photos and they see everybody like this. But that's because the shutter speed was so slow that if you try to maintain a smile, I'd be like, after I don't know how many minutes they had to sit there and for that exposure to happen. So the clue was, hey, just try to stay still. And so then we come with through our looking glass, our view, and we go, look at those hard times. They were hard times. But to think that they were just melancholy and just, oh, I don't like my life, you know. Not that it was just a long photograph process. So looks like another farmhouse. Family. People didn't get very tall back then. In fact, one thing I forgot to even point out was in the process, now I'm changing subjects. This is aside. This is what of those 250 to 300 man hours when we're talking about them cutting wheat fields. No, I'm like an idiot, but so you have a whole bunch of guys being all masculine and competitive, swinging this scythe. And a lot of them, if they're doing wheat, they'd have a little collection basket on there, kind of bundle it up, and then they'd spill that off into a row. So they're swathing. Today we call those machines swathers still, although they're actually putting everything in the middle. And it was hard times in that. After you do all that swathing, then somebody would come by and they'd bundle it into shocks or whatever they call it. And then it'd sit out in the field and somebody come by with a pitchfork, toss it into a wagon, and they'd roll that wagon over to the barn. A barn like the one I had shown earlier with one of the big high peaks. And they actually cut the wheat when it was a little bit green because you didn't want to wait right up until the point where the wheat heads are just going to fall out of the husk. Because then that's complete loss. You're already not getting very many bushels per acre just due to the primitive times. And so then they'd put all that stuff in the barn, let it cure or ripen, so to speak. And then they'd draw all those out and they'd have a major threshing day. And it was a neighbor, it's almost like you'd throw a barbecue for this. You know, we're going to thresh. Okay, then you next, and over to the Johnsons, whatever. And so they get it all out onto a flat surface, probably not concrete because they didn't have a lot of that. At least the farmers didn't. So they'd have some packed, hard, smooth dirt. They'd run the horses over all these shocks or these, they'd unbundle it and scatter it out and just, hey, horses, get hyper, you know, run over all that stuff. And knocks all the weed heads out, and they pick up all the stalks, which is straw, and they store that for, animal bedding later. And then they have to take and sweep up the small stuff, put it into a gunny sack. And then they need to wait for a windy, breezy day that's not raining. And when you get that day, that's the next task is called winnowing. You get to the top of that high peak in that barn that's not on the picture, right? And you would pour the bag out slowly, and the wind would just carry the chaff off to the side. And what you really wanted would fall into the bin directly below you. You would have to do that multiple times. And then, because if you didn't clean out your wheat, you wouldn't get a very good price at the grist mill. They'd open up your bag and go, take that back. We can't make food out of, chaff. So anyway, that was just a part of that process of how long it took just to do that motion. Then the other thing that you encountered was by the time you did get your harvest in, by the time you did get threshing done, and then you got the winnowing done, well, guess what? Now it's raining every day. You cannot pull a wagon across any county road to McMinnville or wherever your closest grist mill is. And you get stuck. You get stuck in a rut. And so a lot of times they would wait for a very hard freeze. When the ground's hard, it'd be one rough ride to town, but you're not getting stuck. And then they'd take it to the grist mill and start that process of making flour. This looks like a little fishing trip. I see a boat. I mean, I'm just speculating like you guys are. If you had a better presenter, they'd probably tell you more things, right? And there's all kinds of community bands. A lot of times on those stern wheeler boats that we saw in a previous picture, they'd have a band on a special day. In fact, it was pretty interesting. Lafayette was called the Athens of the Willamette Valley. Whoa, that's big, right? Well, it's because they'd have circuit riders or orators that would come by and talk about whatever the talk of the day is on a Sunday afternoon. People with money up in Oregon City would go, hey, Ethel, let's get on the boat and let's go down to Lafayette and we'll have lunch, maybe on the boat. I don't know if they're that. But then they would sit there at the Lafayette Park and listen to the orator. And they'd have bands, they'd have music. And that was a very typical community event. And that park that I'm talking about is actually just off of Bridge Street and back there. It's a softball field now. And there's a little manufactured home. It's not a home, I mean, it's a community center in there, just along the riverbank. And some, who knows, this could be a turkey rama. Probably pre-turkey. I mean, we have turkeys here, but turkeys got big in the 40s, 50s, and 60s here in the Willamette Valley. And your typical schoolhouse. We've had over 101 different schoolhouses in Yamhill County or more. And somebody said something? No. I didn't know if I was wrong or something. But not all at one time. Some schools get rebuilt 2 or 3 times. And, the reasons why we moved away from little schoolhouses was because our transportation got better. And when our transportation got so much better, we actually had a thing called a school bus that could actually drive on roads that had rock on them. And so then we consolidated, and eventually all the schoolhouses started falling apart. We were lucky enough to get the Hutchcroft School out here, and it's the beginnings of a pretty cool project that the society is going to be taking on, building a little village out there. Hopefully I'm okay to say that. But and that's going to happen out there just beyond through the doors out there. And horses. And that is all. So that's the presentation. It go like 90 minutes. Sometimes it just gets carried away.
I would imagine people might have a couple of questions.
And sure,
If you're willing.
I can make up answers too. I'll try to.
One about the donation land claim.
Yes.
Did you wait, you come across, in this big wagon and stuff, you get out here, you run out and slide it out then, or did you get it?
It was
signed
first,
when you were back there and?
yeah, we would think they must have like a map with square grids, so everybody's property looks good. No, they didn't. It was, come out, if you're the fastest guy, you get the best land. But there was a rule passed a little bit later, because what was happening was people were coming out and go, I want this, 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 this. Okay, I'm gonna go back to Virginia. And then what would happen is, then you get claim jumpers. And then they passed a rule because, hey, we can't be doing that. People need to be on their land, they need to live there. And the other thing that was happening, because it was just simply more convenient, people would claim their land, but then they'd go and they'd build a house in town. And they'd go out to do their farming, if they did, but they would live in town where there was more accommodations for convenience, right? But then there was a rule passed and they said, hey, you need to clear X amount of acres and have tillable land. And it was noted by 1860 that all the really good farmland was already gobbled up. And so then people started becoming loggers and claiming land up where there's something else. Because after all, when you moved out here, you were coming out here because you wanted to work and there was opportunity. And while the farming opportunity narrowed down, there was still more to be claimed up in the woods. And so hopefully that answers the question. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
What about Indians?
Indians. So the early Hudson Bay traffic, or the Fort Vancouver, the Indians in our area were exposed to more disease sooner, and there wasn't as many in this area. In fact, John Baker, who came over, we're talking about him earlier, but he wasn't with the Newbys, I don't believe, he was a year earlier. But there wasn't some wagon parties would encounter more Indian conflict than others, and some just like, we never had a problem, John Baker noted that the first cabin that he built, which would have been somewhere out near Bethel Baptist Church, right along Baker Creek there somewhere, I'm guessing. I think his second home was like more towards Davison's or something, but anyway, when he first put his cabin up, he didn't have any windows, didn't have any doors. He had a hide, cow hide or some kind of hide, maybe a deer hide over the front door. And he recalls, just curious, native coming by, lifting the flap, looking in there, and it was noted, someone would say, we've never seen a white woman, And so they were just curious. And some tribes were way more friendly than others. I've heard that the Tualatin, I can't remember the proper name for them, Tuality, or they were more like marauders and they would go rob other Indians, So you just as human nature is, we all have, there's good people and there's people that you don't want to live next, So the Indians in this area I guess what I was trying to say was they kind of thinned out due to disease by the time 1843 through 50s and 60s came along. That's all I know about that. Yes.
You want to touch on anything about the Black people when they lived here and how there was a north part of town?
Yeah, it wasn't really friendly here. There was rules in some cities, they're called sunset cities. And that is, if you were not white, and when the sun goes down, you got to get off the streets. Or I don't know what they would arrest you or what. I also know that, the Oriental Gardens, it used to be out by Wilco. What's that? No, it's Mazatlan. Yeah, now I'm dating myself. But they had to go out of the city limits to have their restaurants. They were not allowed. And there were way more Asian people here than blacks at the time, because at one point there was as many as I have heard 60,000 Chinamen here to help with the railroad construction. And then they got into mining, but our society did not allow them in on the main, it wasn't a level playing field. They were limited to jobs, and this is even worse to say this, jobs that a woman would do, because that's what it thought back then. Laundry, they could do laundry, they could do some of these things. It was just so warped, right? So we look around today and it's some major progress, right? I mean, Anybody else?
Well, some of the Chinese lived underground on Third Street.
Yes, so there's evidence of that under the old Elks building. They had like an opium den or something down there, did they? What? No, I'm thinking of
It
Pendleton.
was a Chinese
But the
Chinese
Elks-
restaurant with a hotel, Chinese hotel, gambling den, opium den, all
Yeah.
that there.
A place where they could gather and be safe in their own community. So above that would be the Crescent Cafe. The upstairs is the old Elks building, and it was a youth building, beautiful building up there. Sometimes they do walking tours of Third Street. I don't know when the next one is, but if ever they let you into that building, it's quite remarkable. A lot of beautiful stained glass.
Can you talk a little bit about the heat that is underground, the downtown Main Street,
What is it?
the heat, I guess it used to be heating system?
Oh, yeah, the steam.
Steam.
So when we were talking earlier about the Wright building where this Sage is in the back of the little restaurant. Well, I mean, all the pipes went underground. I don't know that there was tons of tunnels everywhere. A lot of the buildings down on Third Street, you can go basement to basement. That's not a tunnel, that's just a connected basement. There was one tunnel that I know of that went from the old Oregon Mutual building over to underneath where the US Bank drive-through is. And that was like the break room on that side. My grandma used to go underground, go under the street, said, oh, you could hear the cars going over top, you know? And then they'd pop up over there and either it was records or lunch. I don't quite remember what she told me, but that was a totally legit tunnel. But nothing like if you've heard of the tunnels of Pendleton, Seattle, those are phenomenal tours. If you ever make it out to Pendleton, 1:30 every day, you can go for like, I think 20 bucks, 15 bucks. And they take you through, there was literally miles of tunnels under that city, you know. Now we're off topic, we're talking about Pendleton. But Pendleton was like the Vegas or the Sin City of the West. It had no law enforcement until about 1900, just nothing. So that's where everybody collected to get away from the law. And that's why the tunnels were made. It was for the merchants because they needed to get all their stuff from the train depot. But they didn't want to get robbed trying to take it off the train. So somehow they'd get it off the train, take it underground, and then they wheeled it all over the whole town. And one clue to look for, if you're ever in a town that has tunnels underneath, there's that prism glass. It's either kind of purple or green. It fades, it turns that color over the years. And that's to let light in to the tunnel that's below your feet. So you're at street level, walking, you see this in Astoria, I think, a couple spots. You don't see that in McMinnville, but you're like, why is that there? You know, and that's to let natural light in for all the storefronts that were underground. Over there in Pendleton, they had all kinds of speakeasies. You can go there and see bullet holes in doors where they're, you know, shooting it out at the local watering hole. So, yes.
Do you have any information on the locks, the Lafayette lock?
Yes. So the Lafayette locks were built way too late. They were finished like, I think, November of 1901. And they were a pipe dream of the 1850s. Because naturally, when you come to this muddy ground here where you can't get a wagon across the ground until it's either dry or frozen, your natural thing would be to go to the river. Well, unfortunately, if you've seen the Emmett River from an aerial, we didn't have one here. I mean, it looks like your garden house. So, you know, nothing straight. It's not fast. If you're to walk from Dayton to the Willamette River, it's just not even 2 miles, you know, not even. But if you float on a boat, like I've done countless times, so I'm doing it, it takes like 6 miles to get to the river, you know. Well, these locks were put in to raise the level 15 feet. So you could come in one of these big boats that we saw earlier, and it's 125 feet long in the locks. You float in, they shut the dam door behind you or whatever you want to call that door, and they fill it up. That wasn't cussing. And they fill that up, and then you go along, and that allowed boats to get clear into McMinnville. And so basically it put the river in McMinnville at flood stage. So it was up over the banks, or at least at the top of the banks, and then they could float those big old boats over, you know, well, the first thing they needed to get over was the little, they called it Yamhill Falls in Lafayette. And it was not pretty. I mean, it wasn't like, whoa, look at this falls. It was like 2 boulders and a spot where you wouldn't even want to take a canoe over, right? So they had to build that 15-foot raising with those locks to get over that section, to get further in, so we could get stuff into McMinnville year round and not rely on flooding in order to get a boat up here. There was a few industrial things along the Yamhill River here in McMinnville that I don't know that we have any pictures of, but there was some kind of a steam mill that ran something. I'm giving you so many details. But really the riverfront that was popular was Dayton. Dayton was always accessible year round. They'd have to dredge out a sandbar once in a while, quite often actually. They'd have to clear trees that would fall into the river. And so we look at the river today and we think, you know, it must have been so much prettier back then. It wasn't. Like those guys, they took all the trees off all the riverbanks because they didn't want them falling in and having the boats hit them. Well, then when you cut all the trees down, then what happens? It erodes, and then you get all kinds of silt, and you have to dredge the river. They had to do that several times. So the locks ran from 1901 to 1950 something, and it never made any money. The government had to take it over because no private person would even want to put $1 into it because it was too expensive to operate. And then on top of that, there wasn't that much boating traffic. That will be covered in our next session. What do we call that? It was a pretty clever name, I think.
Choo-choo trains, cheats, and shenanigans.
Yeah. Sounds even way sexier than this one. You have to come back to that. But we will talk more about the locks in that one. We'll talk about the trains. And the reason why the locks didn't make it was because the trains could pretty well go everywhere, so to speak, right? And that was also a mistake between Lafayette and actually, we have more time now, so I can say it. Lafayette thought that when the train came through town in 1879, that, well, we're Lafayette and we have the courthouse, they'll just put the train through our town because they need us, you know? Well, railroad doesn't need any town per se. They need to get to Portland, they need to get to like big towns, but all these little farming communities, the reason why is because, well, they're not going to pay extra money to go against the lay of the land and try to figure out how to get up to, let's say, Yamhill. Yamhill is, the train's a little ways out of town because that's where it made sense to cut a grade. And McMinnville knew this. So as soon as they heard about railroad coming into town, that's more details we can talk about next time. But well, they said, we have to have railroad in McMinnville. And they put up $100,000 of funds that were collected to get the railroad to not stay over at St. Joseph. You know where St. Joseph is, where the Kubota tractor dealership is. St. Joseph is named after Joe Gaston, which is Gaston, Oregon. He was a journalist, kind of a media guy of that day, but he had a big heart for railroad. And so he got the railroad to that point, and there's more details. We can talk about that one in the next one. But they pulled up 3/4 of a mile of track that went from basically the Kubota dealership to the Yamhill River, which would kind of line you up with like the back of Evergreen-ish. Excuse me, sorry, in that area. And then they redirected it over to McMinnville, paying $100,000 and supplying all kinds of wood for the 3 extra trestles. And those 3 extra trestles are Cascade steel. There's a big one there. That's the tallest trestle in the valley, like 85 feet tall. And then to get out of McMinnville, you have to go over by the Davis Dip or the Ford Dip. There's one over there. And then the giant one out by the bayou, that wouldn't have had to have been built had they just made it go out past the airport and get on the what they call the Dayton Prairie and went over to Amby that way. So that thing didn't happen, and McMinnville got railroad. And so to cap it all, to say McMinnville got water and light. Well, first it got a bank, you got the water and light, you got a train, what else do we get? We had a steam heat through all the downtown district. We had more brick buildings because everybody wanted to be here, you know. So that is the vision that was cast. And, you know, they weren't naive in making the planning to have a successful town. It doesn't just happen by accident. Sometimes it takes a lot of moving and shaking. Yes.
Good question. Where were the bricks made? Were they made up in Oregon City or were they made down here?
Usually right close. So there was a brick plant behind Linfield College area. There was a lumber yard down there too. There's a lot of bricks made down in Willamina. And some bricks were special, and I've never sorted this out or figured it out. But some bricks were kind of beige in color. And so it's a different kind of clay. And one of the buildings, I think the IOOF building is one of those buildings with a different color. And sometimes you just see like a brick building and then you got tan bricks. Like even the church I go to at Sunrise, they've got like some inlaid different colors of bricks, you know, with just regular red bricks. Yeah.
I got a couple questions. Bricks were made for Marv Gordon's place, was.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm kidding. But I'd like you to talk
Concrete.
more. I'd like you to talk more about the lake between Carlton and McMinnville and all that area.
Oh, yes.
Sometime let us know about
So you want to talk about the Carlton Lake or the,
Yeah. Lakeside, yeah.
so Carlton Lake or the McMinnville reservoirs?
No, the lake that was out
Okay.
in Carlton, where the
So-
lakeside feed drain is.
Yep, yep. So there was 5 different mills around that lake, lumber related. There was a Carlton and Coast Railroad that had a trestle that went across this lake. And this lake that we're talking about is west of Carlton. And it is not a very deep lake, probably a lot of mosquitoes. Because it's just a pretty shallow bellied farmland that they flooded. And the dam blew out, I think it's 63 or 68. And they've tried to get that thing going again, but no avail. But I don't know a ton about that lake other than what I've just told you. But it was a log floating lake.
Oh, okay.
And one other thing that was interesting in the early days was it was called splash damming. And so again, almost all the subject matter that we keep coming up with tends to come down to this. It's hard to get things from here to there. So how are we going to do it? We're going to float it on the river. Trains are expensive and nobody built a train for a while. So what they did was they would dam up any river they had, and the mills would fill it up with logs floating on this lake back there. Now, this is not what they used that lake for. That lake was a stockpile to just float the logs. And by floating the logs in the lake, it keeps them from drying out and cracking, and they can cut the lumber and that stuff. But splash damming is this thing where they dam up the river and all of a sudden, bam, they open up the gates and it just goes, it's just like a big toilet flush. It comes down and it blows out every farmer's fences, logs, cows running the highland. And, you know, that would not be a very good neighborly thing to do. And as you imagine, there was court cases about that and they had to make that illegal eventually. So anyway. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Kory. We appreciate it.